This is part 2 of my videos on Russia, and just to recap, the Russian Revolution has just taken place, and Lenin, Trotsky and the Bolsheviks, aka the Boys, well, they've taken power in Russia in October of 1917. And congratulations, you're the first country in the world to be run by Marxists. You celebrate by abolishing private property. So immediately in November, the Bolsheviks want to hold elections to legitimize their regime. So the first free elections in the country's history is held in the Constituent Assembly, and the Bolsheviks lose. So, of course, Lenin dissolves the Constituent Assembly, outlaws all other political parties, and eventually makes Russia a one-party, one-ideology state. Now that's what I call democracy. And let's not forget that Russia is still in a massive war in Europe, so Lenin announces the decree on peace, which promised Russia's withdrawal from the First World War. Trotsky was in charge of peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk, and after over 3 years of fighting and over 6 million German and Austro-Hungarian casualties on the Eastern Front, you already know that they're not going to let the Russians off lightly. The Central Powers demanded that the Russian Empire allows national self-determination in its borderlands, and that meant giving up Ukraine, Poland, Finland and the Baltic states. But Trotsky had a brilliant plan. He genuinely believed that a communist revolution in Germany was imminent, which would end the war altogether. So he delayed negotiations and stalled for time. Turns out he was wrong, and after a few months of stalling, the Germans just got fed up and started to march on Petrograd. Lenin intervened and said that they have to sign now, no matter what the cost. So now Germany offered the Bolsheviks much harsher terms. Russia was to pay indemnities, disarm their army, and lose a massive chunk of territory. Honestly, I think there's a case to be made that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was actually much harsher than the Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany after the First World War. With the stroke of a pen, there was peace on the Eastern Front, but Russia had lost a third of its population and 2/3 of heavy industry. And to rub salt in the wound, Russia was about to enter one of the most brutal civil wars in history. So the Russian Civil War starts, and it's pretty much everyone versus the Bolsheviks. The Red Army was the Bolshevik militant force, whilst the White Army was your anti-communist opposition. And then there's a Green Army who just hate everybody, but it's mainly between the Reds and the Whites. The Red Army were definitely the underdogs, and at the start of the war, they were only controlled about a fifth of Russia's land, and they definitely did not have the majority of popular support. But a couple of things went their way. For one, the leadership of Leon Trotsky was incredibly important. Whilst Lenin handled politics and ideology, Trotsky was in charge of the army. He basically had to build an entire Red Army out of the shambles of the old Russian army. And during the war, Trotsky would travel to the front lines, giving motivational speeches and inspiring his troops. Then you have the White Army, who were made up of a lot of different groups, such as monarchists, liberals, more moderate socialists, and even some non-Russians who just wanted independence. All of these groups had different motives, but what they could agree on was that the Bolsheviks had to go. Britain, the USA, France and Japan also stepped in to support the Whites because these countries hated the idea of Bolshevism and didn't want it anywhere near their countries. But a little side note in the story, the ex-Tsar Nicholas II and his family were still alive, and the Bolsheviks kept them in a safe house in the city of Yekaterinburg. But on the 17th of July 1918, as the White Army approached the city to liberate Nicholas, he and his family were sent to the basement of their house and were executed. So a couple of months later, and the Central Powers collapsed, and the Bolsheviks now had an opportunity to win back the territory they had lost after signing Brest-Litovsk. They took back Ukraine and the South Caucasus, but unfortunately for Russia, they still lost Poland, Finland and the Baltic states. The civil war went on for a few more years, and it was clear that the Reds had some massive advantages. For one, they controlled the railways and industry in Russia, and this was incredibly important. This meant that they could transport anything to the front lines. From army munitions to iPods, they had you covered. Reason number 2 is that they were also a lot more effective at conscripting soldiers. Turns out people don't like to be forced to fight in wars, and so the Whites had a massive problem with desertion. As the Red Army made serious gains, the foreign powers started to realise that the war was a lost cause, and support for the Whites started to collapse, and the Bolsheviks simply came out on top. Then in 1922, the Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian and Transcaucasian Soviet Socialist Republics combined to make a giant Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, aka the Soviet Union, aka the Motherland. Coming out of the Civil War, the situation was really bad. Over 10 million people had been killed, Over 3 million people had fled the country, and the economy was producing far below its output in 1913. Lenin tried the whole socialism thing by nationalizing industry, banking, transport, and foreign trade, but the economy was still massively underperforming. They had to offer economic relaxations through the new economic policy, which allowed private trade and small-scale private enterprise. It was a shift back towards capitalism, something that Marxists weren't a huge fan of, but it did get Russian industry back on track, just in time for a little psycho to take power, who would turn the Soviet Union into the first fully socialist state in history. So Lenin suffers from a series of strokes and dies in 1924, and there was a massive question about who was going to replace him. It was between Trotsky and a guy called Joseph Stalin, and if you thought Lenin was controversial, wait till you meet Joseph. So Stalin weaved his way to the top, of course doing some very shady things in the process, and Trotsky is forced to leave the country, and he eventually ends up in Mexico. With Stalin at the wheel, he abandons the new economic policy and makes a full shift towards what he called socialism in one country. Centralized economic planning was introduced through 5-year plans, and Stalin's achievements were impressive. Between 1929 and 1940, Soviet industrial production tripled, and the USSR became the second largest economy in the world. Even more significant, this centralized Soviet model seemed to be immune to the destructive effects of worldwide depression in the 1930s. The Soviet Union was becoming a modern industrial economy, and this was also marked by a massive boom in literacy. Then in the rural parts of the Soviet Union, where the majority of the people still lived, you have a process called collectivization. In this system, peasants were forced to give up their individual farms and join together with other peasant households to form one giant, big communal farm. In these collectives, peasants would live and work together, and they were given production quotas by the state. By 1940, almost all peasant households were collectivized, but this process was a very messy one. A lot of peasants would rather destroy their own equipment or kill their livestock than hand them over to the collective. Collectivization was also used for a little game of class warfare. The wealthier peasants called kulaks were seen as bourgeois and were targeted by the state, and around 5 to 7 million people were identified as such. That meant they're either going to get arrested, executed, or sent to slave labor camps called gulags. But by liquidating the most productive peasants in the country and forcing grain requisitioning, this caused a major famine in the early 1930s and hit Ukraine and the South Caucasus very hard. Somewhere between 5 to 10 million people died during the Great Famine, and there's a big question about whether Stalin did it on purpose to eliminate the Ukrainian independence movement. So we've established that Stalin wasn't exactly a good guy, but in the late 1930s he's making this very clear. He slaughtered millions of his own people, and no section of society was safe from him. The notorious secret police, the NKVD, really ramped up their activities, and by 1939, nearly 3 million people were in the Gulag system. People could literally snitch on their neighbours to get them taken away, which doesn't actually sound too bad. Anyway, to get rid of his critics, Stalin held public show trials in which the old Bolshevik leaders were accused of phony charges and made to confess after a lot of torture. This removed all his political rivals. So essentially, society was completely controlled by the government, and the government was completely controlled by Stalin. You may have seen these photos of some guy literally getting erased from history. I wouldn't feel too bad for him though, Yezhov was a real piece of work. Stalin also attacked religion and even his own army, purging tens of thousands of Red Army officers. This perceived weakness of the Red Army was one of the main reasons why Nazi Germany believed that they could attack and defeat the USSR. And that's for the next video. See you then.